Welcome, everybody. We'll give a few more minutes for folks to jump right in. Appreciate the folks that are excited to come in right at 9 o'clock on the dot. Thank you. Welcome. Welcome to folks who are joining. Again, we're going to give a couple more minutes to get folks in the room. Folks, while you're waiting, looks like we got some good folks can change their names. You could have your name identify as a RAC member, in particular pronouns if you choose to share. Be helpful for our audience and for us as we go through the process today. So welcome as folks are joining. Again, we're just giving a couple minutes for folks to make their way in. For RAC members, if you can hover over your name square and click rename and identify in your name that you're a RAC member, that'll be really helpful. We'll get started in just another minute or so. Well, why don't we get going? So welcome everybody to this is the fourth meeting of our Rulemaking Advisory Committee. It's great to see folks this morning. We've got a few hours in front of us, a lot to cover, so I'll be relatively brief in this opening. So if we move to the next slide, just I'll do a little bit of our housekeeping before we get going. So just as a reminder, we do have closed captioning available. If you depending on what your screen looks like, you can click on more on the bottom of your screen. And if you hover up to captions or the CC, you can click on closed captioning if that makes your participation easier. I'll remind folks this meeting is being live streamed and recorded. For those, we can put in the chat. You can comment for our public viewers. You aren't able to contribute in the meeting itself, but we do have the ability to comment to DLCD, and that's through the housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov. We are, for the folks in our meeting, if you have technical or any other supports during the meeting, we got Madeline Miller, who's going to be our designated responder to chat today. So please message her. Any chats that you all have that are substantive, we will copy and paste to make sure that our public viewers are able to see the contributions, and anything else that's technical support or anything other communications, you can message directly to Madeline. How do we get to meeting guidelines? So I guess I'll talk about meeting guidelines. So as we go through our process today, just as a reminder, we got a lot of folks in the room. We do ask as we build community and ensure that we hear from all the folks' expertise around the RAC table, that you do so with a eagerness to seek to learn and understand each other's perspective, to maintain a level of respect, be candid, seek to be productive and constructive in our conversations. You are an advisory group. Your input is incredibly helpful as we work towards our process of developing draft rules. We can seek to resolve differences, find common ground to the extent that rulemaking advisory committees are aligned in certain areas. That's really helpful, of course, for an agency in drafting rules, and discussing topics together rather than in isolation. So, bringing things into the room as much as possible is really important for our deliberation, our discussions, and our exploration of these kind of complex ideas and policy concepts that we're grappling with, and avoid surprises, right? So we encourage you all to bring things early into the process as much as possible. As a reminder, we do have the opportunity to submit comments. As I said before, housing.dlcd@dlcd.oregon.gov. For RAC members, if you submit, you can include for DLCD staff only or for public comment. And that goes for our audience as well for ONA rulemaking and RAC. So working through, if we go back to our agenda, we'll do some introductions in a second. We'll get an overview from Ethan, opening up our space. We'll invite Anita in to remind us and ground us in the racial equity framework and to carry those ideas, concepts, and principles as we have our conversation today. And then we'll be in several substantive conversations. We will get an update first from on housing capacity and urbanization, the technical advisory committee that's doing that work. And then we're going to really try some new processes. So as we get a briefing and context for the housing accountability and framework, we'll get an update from the work that's coming out of the technical advisory committee. And then we're going to go into discussion. And I'll talk more about the process later, but we're going to be using a new structure in this space, including breakout rooms and using some virtual tools, really with the intent of finding additional ways for RAC members to participate. And again, we'll talk more about kind of what that's going to look like when we get to those sections. But it's really the hope that we're creating more space for all the expertise, wisdom, knowledge, and perspective around this table to be able to contribute to the conversation. So it'll be a new practice for this rulemaking advisory committee, but we are hopeful that it really allows all the different voices to contribute in a more meaningful way. And again, I'll talk more about that when we get to that space. So we'll have those two breakouts around housing accountability and framework, and then the needs and production technical advisory update and discussion. So we'll have, again, two breakout spaces. And then we'll close and get you out of here by noon. So before I keep going, why don't I pass it to Ethan? Ethan, if you want to provide some opening remarks, and then we'll do roll call.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Suckmeyer. I'm the manager of the Housing Division at the Department of Land Conservation Development. Welcome to RAC 4, which is the final meeting, I guess I'll say, in this information collection phase of the rulemaking. So today we'll be discussing two topics in great detail: the Housing Acceleration Program and the kind of outstanding questions related to that work, and the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee will be talking about kind of the form and format of how DLCD can support local governments in the translation of needed housing at the local government level. But I do want to just make a note here that we'll be taking a break for the Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting after this one, and we won't reconvene until July 17th. And the purpose of that break is for DLCD staff and the project team to work together to kind of do some heads down writing of the rules. And so we can come back to you with a first draft of the rules at our next meeting on July 17th. And what I think personally, myself and I think some the rest of the folks on the team are really looking forward to that time to actually get you something to kind of respond to throughout this process. And if you've been kind of itching for that and hoping for that throughout this process, it is coming up shortly. So I think the conversation that we'll have as a rulemaking advisory committee today will look and feel different when we come back together in July. We'll be talking about draft rules, and you'll have some language to actually bounce around, redline, provide comments to. So, the conversation today really kind of feeds into that drafting when we kind of go internal in June and start writing. So much appreciated for what I know is going to be a fruitful and productive discussion today. Back to you, Ben.
Great, thanks, Ethan. So let's do a quick roll call, and then I'll pass it to Anita, and we'll start getting into the agenda. So if you could just identify with a here, I, thumbs up, hands up, some mechanism, let me know. And it's going to go in no particular order, but we're going to start with Alan Hines. I can see you, Alan. Thank you. Ben Gerwitz.
Here.
Thank you. Kim McCarty. Anna Molina. So I saw you, Anna.
Here.
Thank you. Beth Barker Hidalgo.
Here.
Thank you. Corey Harlan.
Here.
Garrett Stevenson.
Here.
Thank you. Kathy Wild.
Here.
Thank you, Kathy. Mary Kyle McCurdy.
Here.
Thank you. Rachel Abori Bidu.
Here.
Chantal Evenso. Gloria Sandoval.
Sorry, Chantal's here.
Chantal, thank you. I know y'all gotta be quick on that mute. I'm moving fast. Be ready to go. Mercedes Elizalde.
She's just logging in.
Okay, we'll mark her as being present. Shannon, I saw you somewhere.
Here.
Thank you. Alyssa Gertler. Jessica Blakely.
Here.
Thank you. Mac Cunningham.
Present.
Thank you. Victor Saldana.
Here.
Samantha Baer. Sean Hobbs Waters.
Here.
Thank you. And then I see Kim in the waiting room. So team, if folks are coming in and I miss them, I won't go backwards. Just please note for the record. Alan Lazo.
Good morning, all.
Thanks, Commissioner. Ariel Nelson.
Good morning.
Morning. Brian Rankin.
I am here, thank you.
Yes, you are. There you are. David Madison. Kelly Hart.
Here.
Thank you, Kelly. Miranda, I'm not going to butcher your last name. I did it last time. Miranda.
Good morning.
Thank you. Patricia Diefendorfer.
Apologies. Here. Good
Thank
morning.
you. Tara Wilcoxon.
Morning.
Thank you. Ann Kelly. Brandon Persinger. Holly Kearns.
I'm here.
Thank you, Holly. Lindsay Hutchinson.
Here.
Julia Metz.
Here.
Thank you. Brock Nation.
Here.
Thank you, Brock. Ted Reed.
Morning.
Thank you. Kasara Phipps.
Here.
Thank you. Becky Baxter.
Here.
Dana Hicks.
Here.
Jim Johnson.
Hi, Ben.
Hello. Kelly Glenn. Lucia Ramirez. So I saw you, Lucia.
Here.
Thank you. Megan Bolton.
Here.
Thank you. Michael Rock. Ryan Vandenhoof.
Present.
Thank you. Richard Rogers.
Here.
Thank you. Joy Vaughn. Ellen De La Torre. Samuel Goldberg. Al Johnson. Am I getting into folks that aren't here, team? Okay, great, thank you. I was starting to name TAC members. Thank you, team, for calling me out before I went through another few minutes of calling people that aren't supposed to be here. So thank you for that. Anita, let's pass it to you. We'll bring that back up to slides and move into the racial equity framework. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Good morning, everybody. My name is Anita Yap, and I am part of the project team. I'm helping the RAC and also the DLCD team to address this racial equity framework for decision making. And again, we have Commissioner Alan Lazo here from LCDC that helped create this, and expectation for providing feedback on this to the commission once the rules are completed. So what I am going to do, like I have done before, is take a look at these 8 categories, and as we are having discussion, kind of insert some questions for you all to help answer, because this will be really helpful for the DLCD staff and the commission to really understand these different categories in the rulemaking. And I'll just read them really quick. Historical inequities, benefits and burdens. And this one in particular relates to who is benefiting and who is burdened, and what sort of mitigation can be done. So be thinking about that. There's data equity and justice, is how we collect data in an equitable and just way. Talking about community engagement and empowerment. So also who's been involved in helping develop these rules, and how are these rules going to do that moving forward within local governments for engagement. Accountability, there's been a lot of talk about accountability, so this is really relevant. Restorative justice is really related to, again, some of the historical inequities and what sorts of things, if this rule can provide opportunities for repairing some of the harm that's happened. Decision making, which is super important, not only in this rulemaking, but also as local governments implement these rules. How is this decision making going to be happening in an equitable sort of way? And then measuring and evaluating outcomes and continuous improvement. So thank you again, and we'll continue talking about this throughout the process. And I will hand it over to Karen.
Good morning, buenos dias, Karen Guillen Chapman with DLCD. Karen is just fine as well. I think what I want to do, well, I'll start off by saying, again, we are bringing you an update on the work that this TAC is doing. We are not bringing you discussion policy questions, but I thought I would take a minute and set up this group for those policy discussions that will be coming to you in the coming months. So I wanted to go back to some of the updates that we shared last month in April around buildable lands and constraints. We shared with you feedback we got from the TAC, and reiterate that this 3-meeting series we're having April, May, and June. So in May, we met with our TAC members, and we discussed estimating capacity, and then got into some specifics around that land inventory for partially vacant land and for redevelopment potential. In June, we'll move into development readiness and really thinking about the infrastructure and facilities planning pieces of that. And these methodologies for the land's inventory is part of the overall capacity analysis and the planning work that a city does when they think about their needed housing, how they're going to assess and plan capacity for that needed housing. You'll hear from NAPTAC what they're talking about in the TAC around what types of housing, location of housing, characteristics for that housing. And so obviously the land inventory really needs to think about what land do we need for which types of housing, what does location look like, and where do we have capacity for that? And then the production strategies moving into, you know, what are those policies that we can adopt locally to really facilitate housing production? And so I thought I would go all the way back to December and just share two comments. I can't even remember when we had the TAC orientations, and I think it was Kearns and West, or maybe it was Deb, that had put a series of questions to each TAC. And I wanted to share with you two sticky notes on that mural board that were put on the CowTAC from CowTAC membership. So we heard during that TAC orientation that was held in December, we heard comments around, we need to reduce our paper capacity and have more realistic assumptions. So when we think about that lands inventory and the capacity for needed housing within an urban growth boundary, there's a lot of assumptions that go into this and how much of it is grounded in realistic data. And I will get into the themes from our TAC that have come out of these discussions. And we were also asked to really consider digging into the demonstration of need for more land. Should there be a need for a UGB amendment? To really be clear and strong and idealistically that this should be tied to the infrastructure needs and the land being development ready. So these are two sticky notes. They were written by TAC members and they were put on a mural board during the TAC orientation back in December. And so when we met with the TAC in May, this is where we focused in on is the estimating capacity, what are some of the statutes and rules that dictate that, and then what are local jurisdictions experiencing as they do this work in their communities. And things we heard about were growth management programs or strategies where larger cities are building new capacity and building new IT resources within their jurisdiction to really monitor growth. But we are often thinking about smaller jurisdictions with less capacity. What does that look like for them? How might the state provide rules that apply both at the larger cities, but also really thinking about how we facilitate and support our smaller cities, that the rules can accommodate both and that guidance might be provided more specifically or more customized for different types of jurisdictions. And then understanding that the data is not perfect. I had a great conversation yesterday afternoon thinking about how buildable lands inventory has evolved and how you collect that data and moving from paper and actually driving around and looking at parcels all the way to our GIS capabilities that we have today. But we know that as you do this inventory, you might underestimate in one area and overestimate in another. And the hope is that the rules provide responsive flexibility, that it really does kind of net a pretty accurate or close analysis to what is realistic. And then understanding staff capacity. So when we were having this conversation yesterday afternoon about actually driving around your community and looking parcel by parcel or having the GIS analysis, not all cities have the same capabilities. And thinking about cities who are starting to set up those capabilities, primarily larger cities, what does that look like for them and what are they needing more guidance on? The last couple here are around, we introduced today's existing statutes, some recent changes, things around the 3% cap, understanding that past trends in development quantity of unity of housing, density of housing, location of housing, and not going over 3% above what your data tells you to, unless you can quantify and validate. We're going over a 3% assumption that will develop denser or higher uses in some of the requirements to validate that. And then the notion that cities are telling us, we're balancing the realistic ability to forecast and estimate what capacity looks like with our aspirational goals of, we would like to see more of these types of housing. We would like to see them in these locations. We'd like to see greater density. But lastly, there are market forces. And so when we think about one city that might be a suburb of a larger city in Southern Oregon versus a town like maybe Joseph and neighboring towns around Joseph, what are the market forces that really impact redevelopment? Just as much or more so than the zoning that the local planners are able to bring to their city councils. So I wanted to share that as an update to let you know where we've been, where we're going, and policy questions we will bring to this group in the coming months. I will pause there. I'm not sure, Ben, I'm going to turn it over to you if we have any clarifying questions or if you want to go straight into hot tech.
No, let's pause for any clarifying questions or reflections back for Karen. Okay, I'm not seeing any. So let's keep moving. So is it Thea? Are we bringing you in
Yep.
for attack? Yep, jump in.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Ben. Hi, everybody. It's great to sort of see you in your little boxes, and I hope everybody's doing great this morning. As a reminder, I'm Thea Croman. I'm a housing planner with DLCD and lead on the Housing Accountability Technical Advisory Committee. So I'm here to sort of set up a conversation for us all to get into around the structure of the Housing Acceleration Program. I wanted to start by sort of giving you a little bit of an update on what we've been talking about in the HOTAC, and sort of bring you up to speed on the conversations there without getting too into the weedy details. So I'll try to be brief. In HOTAC 6, we've had 2 HOTAC meetings since I think we last met together. In the first of those 2, DLCD staff outlined a sort of proposed approach for determining which cities are referred for performance-based audits into the Housing Acceleration Program. This was a straw proposal, and it was just meant to sort of spur the conversation. It's not necessarily our suggested approach, anything like that. It was just something we set up to start that conversation. The proposal sort of included an intention to balance between clarity and certainty for local planning, while also allowing a sort of nuanced and contextual evaluation for city performance, which is what we heard from this group the last time we chatted here. In that meeting with the HOTAC, there were 4 themes that emerged. And just to sort of simplify, we heard a lot about the criteria for referral. So while there's 4 pathways into the referral program, there's really only one that contains ambiguity, and that is for the cities that are performing at the lowest level. Considering a tiered approach to differentiate the level of review for those cities that are considered the lowest performing is where that conversation centered. So we're calling that sort of, in shorthand, like a light touch audit on the one hand and a comprehensive audit on the other. The second theme that we heard the third theme that we heard was really about equity considerations and keeping this top of mind. And this both relates to disadvantaged populations and ensuring that, sort of as Anita pointed out in the beginning, that the consideration of who is benefited and who is burdened by the policies that we create is the primary lens that we're viewing these suggestions through. There's another thing that sort of falls under the language of equity, and I think it's different, but it comes up also often and is very important, which is that smaller and rural cities really have a need to be treated in a different way and need to be considered in a different way. Finally, there's a conversation around the reality of the implementation, that there's going to be challenges. There's limited resources. The data is very imperfect, and there's a desire for clarity and objectivity in this world that is really contains a lot of nuance and needs context. So there's this tension built in there. These were all things that we heard in this HOTAC 6, which is the 6th TAC, but the first of this series, and that we're all going to be sort of building in to the next stage, the next phase of the rulemaking process. We can go to the next slide, and I'll talk about HOTAC 7. We did a similar sort of project here where staff developed a straw proposal for both the audit and the acceleration program. Really briefly, the audit proposes a sort of decision tree for selecting cities for referral based on performance indicators, really with a focus on equity indicators. And the acceleration program proposes 2 tracks. One is expedited, and one sort of remains on the regular HPS cycle of a city. So depending on the impact of the actions that are categorized as within a city's control. There were several themes that emerged in this conversation as well. One is about the difference between a standard and comprehensive audit, which is something that I think we dug into last time. Where to draw the line between an audit that just sort of looks at a set number of required elements, or an audit that digs way deeper into what a city, what is shaping a city's policy around planning for housing. There was also a lot of conversation about ensuring that there were affordability metrics included in both levels, both the standard and comprehensive audit. We heard about equity considerations again, where the location of affordable housing is, and the impact on resource allocation among cities, that there's an imbalance built in there. We talked about the structure of the findings and how to create an output that is within sideboards, but has a range of flexibility in addressing city particularities and building in options for cities. In the agreement, we talked about sort of how to consider different barriers, the level of urgency of the action that's required, and what kind of consequences there are for non-compliance. That we also spent significant time talking about challenges and concerns, again, hearing about a desire for objectivity, limited resources, limited capacity, both at the state and local levels, and this tension between local control versus state authority, and how to balance that. So that's all of that will inform sort of the conversation that we're going to have. And we can go to the next slide, Ellen. We're going to jump into a conversation now here that doesn't get into all of those sort of naughty details and technical details, but I wanted to give that background to you to inform sort of the bigger policy questions that we're bringing to you now. The ones that really rise to the top when you look at the totality of the conversations that we had there. And the first one is, how should DLCD prioritize cities for referral? It's really a simple question, but it kind of contains a world of policy considerations. And among them, like, how should we weigh factors like the severity or shortfall of staff capacity? Should we wade into thorny territory, like identifying a city's intent or considering its history, that's sort of some less objective standards? In the memo that we sent you all, we identified some of the prioritizing factors and some of the mitigating factors that came to our mind as we were working through this, but we really need your help weighing in here. For the second prompt that we're going to be getting into, I'll just preview that. We need to answer the question of who plays in the housing development space, and to what extent DLCD sort of has the power and authority to bring them to the table. We really need your help first identifying all of the actors, and we also really want to hear about how you all see the responsibilities of each and the ideas that you might have, encouraging and incentivizing these actors to work with cities toward better housing outcomes. So I think that kind covers the background. I hope that helps and doesn't just confuse everybody. We're going to jump in to breakout rooms to talk through these questions in smaller groups. So handing it back to you, Ben.
Great, thanks, Thea. So before I kind of outline the process we're going to use going forward, just any questions for Thea? Yeah, Mary Kyle?
Hi, Thea, thanks. So this may be very basic, but I'm not on the hot tech or however that's pronounced. So when we were talking about prioritizing cities for referral, are we already looking at the subset of cities that have been identified through a separate process that are the lowest performing? And I want to finish the rest of that sentence, for referral into either the fast track or whatever, comprehensive or whatever, these various paths for remediation, right? Okay, so we're already in a subset of the lowest performing, however that's been defined. Okay, great, thank you.
Yes, these strands are just getting sort of smaller and smaller.
Right.
Yes, exactly. That's already, and I kind of skipped that step, but yes, of the four ways that cities are referred into the program, we're really only looking at those that are the lowest performing, because that's where there's ambiguity. The other ones are really just, did you submit your HPS? If not,
right. So this is referral into further remedial programs, for trying to use an unweighted word. Thank you.
Yes, support.
I think acceleration is the
right.
Yes. Alan?
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Thea. So just a clarification on when you're talking about lowest performing in this, again, in this second set. So you're asking us what factors should we consider to measure lowest performing here, right? Is that the question that's being asked?
Yeah, and we'll have a lot more information about that question. This is sort of the top line of that question, but when we jump into the breakout rooms, there's some sub questions and guiding prompts and everything. So yes, it's intentionally very vague here.
Yeah.
Well, Sean, yeah, jump in.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I'll just add, last time we talked about, we have to implement this program. We have limited resources, right? So how do we think about prioritizing limited resources? We're kind of drilling down a little bit deeper into that question on the more specifics, like what do we prioritize? What are some mitigating factors, right? Like if we see, these certain things, even if maybe the data points to underperformance, are there circumstances in which it doesn't make sense to refer? So we'll get into that conversation. We'll frame it up. It's really about kind of priority setting. And then the second question is really about that broader, conversation on responsibilities. Everybody has a responsibility in relationship to housing. Let's talk about it in the context of the audit.
Yeah, so Alan, I think the conversation we'll have will be less about how we measure, but what should we be prioritizing? And I think there's a subsequent conversation, you're talking about fair housing, right? If that's how should we prioritize fair housing? And then it's then let's define and measure, right? And have clarity around it. So I think the conversation is going to start at that higher level of where should we be prioritizing for that referral and acceleration? And then there's all of these complex questions around, okay, well, we have to define that in such a way that we can make it work. Hopefully I'm not seeing any DLCD people coming off mute yelling at me, so hopefully that's helpful. Thank you. Any other questions for Thea? Yeah, Anita, or a comment?
Sure. So maybe Thea or Sean, can you describe, before we go out into the breakout rooms, I suppose we're talking about lowest performing local governments, but for folks who don't work for local government, can you give us maybe some reasons why some of these are lower performing? I think it would give us some context as we move into the breakout rooms to ask these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. Who wants to take that on? Thea, you want to start?
Well, no, I was going to pass it to Sean because he's
really sure
with examples.
Yeah. And maybe we should have had a slide at the beginning just as kind of a reminder of the broader structure. So the statute says, all right, DLCD, annually you have this responsibility. You refer some cities into this housing acceleration program. Some of these are pretty straightforward, like did you adopt an HPS or not? Did you adopt actions in your HPS? But the one that's really tricky is also, it says DLCD, you have these different indicators that OHCS is going to track. They're going to track production. They're going to track affordable housing production. And they're also going to track different equity indicators. And, based on this, information that OHCS gathers, refer
essentially what they refer to in the statute as the lowest performing cities into the housing acceleration program. So we have some choices that we have to make in terms of how we structure that.
I don't know, Anita, does that answer your question? I mean, I think there's things like underproduction. So you see, I mean, I think we probably have heard many of the different stories and examples, right, of cities that have been resistant to building multifamily affordable housing, cities that have been resistant potentially to ensuring that more flexible, inclusive zoning is actualized, right? Cities that are consistently showing segregation by race and income, cities that, right? So I think, there's a lot of these conversations that are showing up that kind of paint a big picture of some of the ways that we might think of underperformance. But, I think at the baseline, it's production, affordability, and choice.
I think that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay. And again, I'm not seeing anybody yelling at me about saying the wrong thing, so hopefully that's helpful. So last comments. I mean, these are questions also we can take into the room, but any high level questions that will help for clarity? Yeah, Lucia.
I was just wondering, I know resources are limited and we need to focus help on the people who need it most, but I'm wondering if there's any way we can set up incentives or help people who are doing okay and want to do a lot better. Is there a side program or at least a toolkit and resources that they can go to? Does everything have to be you're doing bad and so we're going to intervene to help you? Or is there
who wants to jump into the—
Hold on one second. So yeah, Lucia, so I'm going to ask that you hold on to that and bring that into the discussion group. One of the explicit things that we want to talk about is that in particular, right? So hang on to that. Let's go into the breakout rooms. Let's start diving into the substantive discussion, and then we can kind of get into it. That's kind of what we want to know today. It's part of what we want to know today.
That's helpful, Sean. And Lucia, you're asking a really important question, right? Do you have to screw up real bad in order to get the love and attention, and incentives and supports? But I think that's a good prompt, Sean. Any other questions? Okay, so let's go to the next slide, and I'll talk. So we're going to be in breakout rooms. You'll have a facilitator. We have our DLCD friends who will be helping to take notes, and we'll in this part of our next part of our agenda. Then when we come back, we'll help to summarize what we've heard, and we're going to have several different mechanisms. So for the first conversation, you're going to see what's called a Miro board, and some folks may have some familiarity with this, but there's a couple pieces that I'll just walk through, and then team, if there's anything I missed that seems really helpful or that I get wrong, just let me know. So for the first part of our conversation, the Miro board will be kind of a note-taking tool, but also a way to visually prompt our conversation. So you can see in the middle of the board, you have kind of the housing accountability, needs and production, capacity and urbanization as examples, where you might then be able to contribute to those as if you had little stickies and we were in a room and you'd write it down and stick it on one of these boards, right? So that's the imagination of this tool. So if you start at the top left corner, I don't know who's driving, if you could kind of circle or put your mouse there, right? So you use that tool when you're using stickies. This is how you would select, right? So you click on the select button and then you would highlight to add a sticky note. You can click there, or you can come over to where this group of colored stickies are in the middle and you can grab and drag, right? So if you're using your mouse, you click on it, you can drag it up to a certain place. And then to add text, you can see where the T is on the left upper corner. You click on that T and go back into your sticky, and then you double click and you can add notes. There is tools, and this is like next level tool. You can connect the sticky notes by using arrows. There's other features that this exists. You can leave comments by clicking on the icon. If you undo or redo, if you want to take something away, that's great. Bottom right, You can zoom in, zoom out. Sometimes these boards can be challenging to see. So being able to use that bottom right, click on the plus, it will make it bigger. Minus will make it smaller. And then when you have a lot of people in a mural board, you'll see at the top right, if you click on that button, it will get rid of all the other cursors. So sometimes it's a wild thing to see when you have giant groups in a mural board and you just see all these floating cursors moving around. That can be really distracting. Team, any other tips or folks that have used Miro, if there's anything you would add, that'll be helpful? Okay, so in our rooms, if you have questions, technical questions, of course, you can continue to email or chat with Madeline if you need support, but also just ask if you need help, and we got folks that can help you navigate the tool. So with that, we are going to magically transport ourselves. We're going to have, I don't know, somewhere in the range of 45 minutes. I'm not going to try to do my math, but we'll 35. Thank you. We'll have about 35 minutes for conversation, then we'll come back and report out as a group. So you're going to be transported. I think you'll probably get an icon that says join a room. So click join, and then you'll go there. So we'll see you on the other side. The old middle of the sentence teleport. Okay, well, it's always traumatic when it happens. You will be going back into the same groups. So, if you need a small moment of time to refresh and finish where you were going before, we can do that. I'll leave it to each of the facilitators and note takers. So we're gonna do some reporting out, very high level, kind of just in time reporting. We did have note takers, we have the mural boards. We'll make sure that, this will not be a repeat of everything that happened in the conversation, but we'll have, you will get information that came out of the other meetings or other groups. So how many groups do we have? Let's start, Sean, let's start with group one. High level.
Yeah. And first I'll start, I think we definitely struggled with the amount of time that we had. So we had to kind of rush through the discussion a little bit. I do want to speak to the first question. I think the two major themes that kind of came up were really about kind of community readiness and capacity of local jurisdictions to kind of participate, and thinking about the staff capacity as one aspect of, kind of prioritization, or thinking about that pretty critically. And then the second piece is maybe a concern about the idea of using fair housing or compliance issues as a prioritizing factor, especially because a lot of these are complaint driven and require a lot of collation to track. So maybe thinking about it more as like a secondary aspect of referral. On the second question, thinking about responsibilities, I think the first part is really actually critically thinking about market forces and the role that governments play in relationship to market forces. So not thinking about them totally as separate or untouchable or things like that, but thinking about them in context of how different things work together. We also talked about how there's a lot of kind of misunderstandings between different levels of government, or different just areas of where people specialize, and having some type of process that get them all kind of talking and coordinated around one issue could be very important in the audit process. And then I think the last piece is really just talking about accessibility, and actually one of the challenges being how the acceleration program, it seems like it's not very well suited to handling issues related to the accessibility of housing, especially in relationship to things like FHA or fair housing, or just affordable housing requirements that are intended to increase the accessibility of housing. So those are some of the high level themes. Again, just being very short and brief, just recognize we have a lot to get through.
All right, thank you, Sean. Group two was Lorelei and Karen. Karen, I think you were the note taker.
Yeah, I will focus on question 2 and maybe briefly hit question 1. But our group, we had a lot of discussion about what is within control of local jurisdictions, what is outside of that control, and really looking at being measured around affordability and do they have sufficient low-income housing? What does that look like from a state legislature, a governor's office really allocating that funding? Even with infrastructure costs, and looking at partnerships with organizations like special districts that provide these urban services. And so really looking at some of the actors that we think of as indirect, but might really have a much more direct when we think about what is or isn't outside of the control of a jurisdiction. And then I think around question 1, really getting at the intent of the program for jurisdictions that have the ability to adopt some policies and what those policies are, really looking at those communities with the greatest need and how that need is being addressed within those policies, understanding a jurisdiction's growth rate and the pressures it might put around housing and needed housing, and some of the higher priority of folks are really feeling underproduction. Frequent compliance issues were of higher priority when considering a referral program. Madeline, anything else I might have missed there?
I think you captured it. Good job.
Okay, who's group 3?
Me.
Yeah.
Yep. Anita, jump in.
Yeah, Celestina was our note taker, and we had a really great group discussion. People had some really great ideas. I'm gonna probably kick it over to Celestina because you have the notes, but stay tuned. This is some good stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. I certainly won't be able to touch on everything, but a few of the highlights for question one was, of course, around infrastructure, and the conversation really spanned both what we typically think of as infrastructure in terms of wastewater and water services, but also more livability considerations, including transportation, and really trying to support the whole community. We also talked a bit about using the local jobs and the income brackets of the jobs in the local area to help assess kind of another layer of what is really needed, and kind of assess unmet need in that way. Folks spent some time talking about their communities and how there is quite a bit of unmet need, particularly for the service provider jobs and workers. And we also did touch on how the acceleration program really in many ways is a way to get more support and access to resources. So a little bit of attention there in terms of considering how a local jurisdiction may not have resources or capacity to do work, and maybe that would mean less of a means for acceleration, but at the same time the acceleration itself could offer more support. So a little bit of attention there. And in question two, a lot of conversation about collaboration, local community groups having a lot of knowledge about the housing needs in their areas, and also even a suggestion for community development organizations and locally based organizations who have had housing development success, sometimes in larger cities, including Portland, offering some knowledge sharing to even some of the smaller communities, and really building off of those wins, even though some of them have been more in the Portland area, and some of the organizations have some statewide reach. But thinking about focusing on collective responsibility was really what came up.
Great, thank you, Celestina. Madi, I think you're group for Deb and Madi.
I am. Thank you, Ben. Our group, so I'll offer some key themes from both questions. In the first question, some of the things that my colleagues here have offered also came up, but the group specifically had, the discussion led to ultimately three top things that might be considered under production, fair housing, and affordability as being kind of top for what should be prioritized for the process. There was some, opinions about whether fair housing is first and top only. And there was some consideration about whether compliance with state law might be part of that. And then part of that discussion also was around how to make this acceleration program also attractive for smaller and rural cities, kind of that tension that Celestina just mentioned too, and how can this offer resources for under-resourced small rural communities, so it's a benefit and it's not punitive. And then for question two, we did have a little delay in responding to this question. There was some confusion, but there was some new actors that were offered. There was a note about appreciating nonprofits being included, as they have a lot of knowledge and actually could educate local governments in ways to use either federal funds like ARPA for the production of housing, or just relationship build. There's also folks offered that HUD is not there, but has been doing a lot of really cool convenings, and maybe should be part of the mix in there. And then also, there was a comment about, if state entities need to align better, perhaps that's a leadership call at the governor's level, and maybe leaning into that might be the right way to go too, as part of this thinking here. Deb, anything else that you want to offer? But otherwise, those are kind of the major nuggets.
I would say one other thing was a desire maybe to call out, especially departments or agencies that have a relationship to infrastructure, water, sewer, roads. I think some of that, they're lumped under cities or under special districts, but to really call out their role being very specific.
Awesome, thank you. Ethan, Cadence?
Right, thanks, Ben. Yeah, in breakout room number 5, we had a good discussion. I won't repeat some of the things that the colleagues already said, but I do want to just kind of point out in question number 1, we kind of talked about these buckets of cities, right? There are some cities that have these kind of political constraints that kind of interfere with, the implementation of housing in the as it's described as kind of like in policy direction. There are others that have resource capacity constraints, and then there's kind of this third bucket of cities that try to do everything that they can, but the factors outside of their control prevent them from accomplishing their goals or achieving their goals. And the acceleration program probably, just due to capacity, can't focus on all of those. And so, the priority would be to focus on kind of those first 2 buckets of, resource constraints, and then where there's like a political, dynamic that's going on. I really liked one of the points that somebody in the breakout room made about kind of at a certain point in this process, we have to assume that cities want to get better and do better in housing, and we just really need to set up the system that's going to give the cities the tools that they need to succeed in that effort. And then on question 2, we talked a lot about about local elected officials in this group, and how that is part of like local jurisdiction, but maybe that's something in specific that that conversation between the state and the local government really should kind of key in on, because they're a huge key implementation partner in that work, and they kind of hold the keys to the policies that eventually get adopted in local governments.
Okay, thank you, Ethan. Cadence, anything to add? Okay, Thea and Ellen, last but not least.
Hi, yeah, I will be real brief because I think a lot of what we talked about was covered, but there were a few elements that rose to the top, a few factors that there was consensus around in our group as being a prioritization factor, specifically under production. There's a little conversation around measuring affordability and how we do that in consideration of these factors. Compliance and frequent compliance issues also came up as a theme, but there's concern around measuring intent behind those compliance issues. For 1B, our group added to the list of mitigating factors. Everybody agreed that these are all important mitigating factors, added natural disasters and litigation as other mitigating factors on that list. And for 2, we did kind of run out of time, but we also heard that we should add onto this list of people working in the housing space, tribal governments and housing authorities. And that conversation, was cut short, but the mural board is up, so we'll be referring back to that to look at some more suggestions.
Great, thank you. Well, awesome. We're going to take a break now, but before we jump in, so the mirror boards are open, so I would encourage you to use your break. Take your break, right? Get energized. But we will keep them open, so you can continue to add thoughts. We're going to come back in now that you've had the experience, right? You've been introduced to the mural board. You've heard the report outs. We're going to try a little bit of different structure. So I'll just prepare you to find your courageous space, because we will ask RAC members to volunteer to report out for your group as we report out after the second conversation on needs and production. So you can start mentally preparing yourself for that ask, lean into the moment, and of course your note taker will be there to support you. So 10:34, why don't we come back 10 minutes at 10:44, and we'll give a little context and jump into our next breakout room. So enjoy your 10 minutes. We'll see you back. Thanks. All right, we're at 10:44. As you all may have realized by now, it's just enough time for me to get some of my Cheez-Its, which sustain me and keep me well and thriving throughout the day. So welcome back. Monty, I think we're gonna move into the needs and production advisory update, some context, and then we'll go back into breakout rooms. So floor is yours.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ben. And hi again, everyone. My name is Mari Valencia Aguilar. I use she or they pronouns. I'm a housing planner at the department and co-leading the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee with my colleague Celestina Teva. So shifting away from the acceleration program now, kind of thinking about the work that local governments do ahead, not ahead of, but just steps that happen to build a housing production strategy. And hopefully, you know, do and are working on their ongoing work. So that's really kind of the focus there. As a reminder, the Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee has some tall order charges, one being the integration of affirmatively furthering fair housing into our statewide planning goal 10 system, and then the translation of housing production targets into various housing types, characteristics, and locations. I'm going to give you an overview of the first topic area, and then I'll hand it off to my colleague Celestina to offer an overview of what the NABTAC has been talking about in terms of the second discussion area. Looks like we're at that. So I'm just going to jump in. We're right at the slide where we're focusing first on the first topic area of integration of AFFH into Goal 10. So the way that I want to start this is by perhaps grounding folks in the definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing so that we're all operating under the common understanding and really what the intent here is. And the obligation to AFH, as statute kind of outlines, is in addition to combating discrimination, AFFH means taking meaningful actions that, when taken together, address significant disparities in housing needs and access to opportunity and replace segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, and to transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. You know, in other words, it's a call to promote fair housing choice, eliminate disparities in opportunity, foster inclusive communities, and overcome patterns of segregation and combat discrimination. So this this new rule is significant. It's to celebrate, and it's an exciting time. Over the last few years, though, I do want to recognize that the Goal 10 has been changing. We've been, since 2019, with the adoption of the Housing Production Strategy under House Bill 2003, you know, the rules around the production strategy does include some, you know, seeds or some nuggets of this AFFH mandate within. Specifically, I'm referring to the Division 8 rules, specifically subsection 50, section 4, that talk about fair and equitable housing outcomes. It lays out 6 factors, 2 of which really kind of have a really direct line to kind of the principles of AFFH, and others that, you know, there's some overlap, but, you know, could you know, further be advanced to emphasize a strong connection of the principles of AFFH. And so really, that leads me to this slide here. You know, as I just noted, there are seeds there. The approach that the NABTAC has taken in terms of that integration of AFFH is to build off of the good seeds that are in the Housing Production Strategy report. Before I dive into that, I do want to say that the federal government, specifically the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, you know, requires entitlement communities or entities that receive federal funds directly from them and therefore are obligated to AFFH. So they have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. they have sort of a set kind of requirement about how to affirmatively further fair housing. Specifically, HUD identifies fair housing issue areas that an entity that receives their funds must kind of identify and address as part of their planning requirements, and sort of think about how they're using these funds that they're receiving to ensure that they're advancing the principles of AFFH. Rather than, wholly taking those on, and because I mentioned that the HPS program has some really good seeds of AFFH in there, the NAPTAC in meeting 7, leaned. We leaned into that approach, but also recognized that the seeds are there, and kind of moved in the direction of how to further, just to be on the same like seed kind of line, water those seeds to better ensure that the AFFH mandate is threaded through those factors. And so on your screen here, on the left, in the blue squares, are the 6 factors that I noted earlier that are currently found in Division 8 rules. And on the right, the green boxes, these are the iterations of the factors that kind of came out of discussion from the NAPTAC, and really kind of build off of the factors, but also kind of ensure that AFFH is embedded in all of them. So I'm going to describe what's on the slide, and give you some helpful kind of background and to kind of give you an overview of where the NAPTAC went. So affordable homeownership and affordable rental housing is a factor that currently exists. It has shifted to fair access and equitable outcomes to housing tenure and wealth building. NAPTAC noted that this binary of homeownership and rental kind of overlooks critical tenure systems like cooperatives or community land trust, particularly those with limited and shared equity programs. So wanted to break out of this binary to ensure that the various housing tenures and equity building opportunities that we see, maybe not as much as we want to see, but we see in the state of Oregon, are not overlooked in the planning process for local governments as they're going through the housing production strategy. Housing options for residents experiencing homelessness remain the same. We just brought that forward. It's a key issue, and it is part of AFFH thinking. So that one was kind of easier to just translate over. Then 2 factors, fair housing and location of housing, exist right now, and those were kind of evolved to what you see on the screen here that says geographic patterns of integration and segregation in the relationship to patterns of affluence and poverty. Earlier, I noted exactly what AFFH meant. So some of those words are exactly, pulling that through and being intentional about how essential the work in federal fair housing planning work really originates from the need to redress exclusionary zoning and access to housing that created racial and ethnic segregation and systematic discrimination that also leads to correlated patterns of socioeconomic status. So that really is kind of the intent with the specific new fair housing issue area, and pulling the thread of AFFH into the housing production strategy report. Another kind of new factor that evolved from the fair housing and location factors, or a new fair housing issue that evolved from the factors of fair housing and location, is fair access to and equitable outcomes to community assets and exposure to harm. So this issue area reinforces housing planning that creates, compact mixed-use neighborhoods with essential services, amenities, and opportunities while mitigating environmental and social risks. Local governments are doing this work already. If you think of the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program, that seeks to kind of meet our statewide greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. This is, really kind of underscoring this particular work, also underscoring what we also may call environmental justice. And while we didn't use those particular words, kind of leaning on what HUD uses, that is really the intent with this particular fair housing issue area. Next, an existing factor is gentrification, displacement, housing stability, and that's been slightly modified. It was pulled over as a fair housing issue. It's a critical, important piece that local governments need to be thinking about and is within the scope of AFFH, so that stayed there. However, we've removed the gentrification element that's currently a factor in the HPS rules, and this was done to center the analysis that local governments do on anti-displacement and housing stability, and also recognizes that sometimes gentrification can lead to wealth building for households so long as there's anti-displacement or stabilization measures in place. We've also shifted from displacement to anti-displacement to frame both of those terms in the affirmative for what housing programs aim to achieve. And then lastly, we've iterated again housing choice and fair housing to fair access to an equitable outcome for housing for people with disabilities. People with disabilities is a protected class, both at the state level and at the federal level. And we wanted to reinforce that here. We've heard a lot of feedback about this particular important issue. And we know that a lot of the complaints that happen at the federal or state level, kind of centers the experiences of people with disabilities. And so the NAPTAC thought, having its own fair housing issue area here would be important. I also want to note that this issue includes mobility, visual, auditory, mental, intellectual, and developmental disabilities. It doesn't. It's supposed to be, inclusive of just the types of disabilities that exist. What you see here are the names of the categories, and so. I think what I offered is hopeful to kind of give you the background of where the direction is going. I'll also say that NAPTAC also had an interesting discussion about possibly new issue area, leaning on the racial equity framework. Some NAPTAC folks offered feedback that maybe there should be a restorative justice fair housing issue area. And so that's something that we as staff are thinking about and have noted. And then there was also discussion about how local governments sometimes have their own protected classes, and should those local protected classes be a consideration as a fair housing issue area. So with that, I am going to hand it. We do not have time for a discussion. This is a critical piece. But I did want to offer you information about the fair housing issue areas and where the NAPTAC is going in terms of really kind of honing in and affirmatively furthering fair housing. I'm going to turn it over to Celestina to take us to our second topic area.
Thank you so much, Mari. We could go to the next slide where I will overview the meeting, NAPTAC's meeting 8. So like Mari said, meeting 7 continued to hone in on affirmatively furthering fair housing, and meeting 8 kind of toggled back to the second issue area of translating needed housing targets into types, characteristics, and locations. And I will say though, while we have kind of chunked these scopes out in order to be able to tackle them one meeting at a time, of course they're very related, and so that's some of the work that that we hope that you will help us with, is really bringing the affirmatively furthering fair housing layer into this work of every part of the HPS program. So meeting 8, we created this table for the first time in terms of helping everybody start to sort out what this process might really look like. And it's a mock scenario of the housing production targets for a large city, which would be over 25,000 in population as defined by the statute. and not in the metro area, so over an 8-year cycle. And what will be produced and offered to the jurisdictions in terms of these targets is that those affordability brackets and the number of units needed in those affordability brackets. And what's not provided is that more contextualization of what that housing actually needs to look like. And the language that we have to work with is that those targets will need to, or what needs to be planned for is the types, characteristics, and locations of the housing that that jurisdiction needs. So like I just mentioned, part of layering the affirmatively furthering fair housing work over this process of getting from affordability and number of units to types, characteristics, and locations is using that fair housing issue areas analysis, along with community engagement and the equity indicators that will also be produced and through OHCS, and that's where the targets, the targets actually will come from DAS, but a dashboard to be able to review those will be through OHCS. But the equity indicators will be another layer that comes into contextualizing this translation to types, characteristics, and locations in order to affirmatively further fair housing. So we had using this table really helped folks start to orient to the task at hand to go from these numbers to types, characteristics, and locations, and then ultimately to a set of strategies in order to build those types, characteristics, and locations. So we just thought I'd highlight this table here to offer it to you as well as a grounding. And with that, we'll go to the next slide, which is the heart of what we really dug into from that grounding. And this is a very clunky, text-heavy table that we put together to start to understand how DLCD would provide direction to local governments to both do that translation, so turning those unit counts into a housing mix, various housing types that are needed, characteristics that are needed, and in the locations that are needed. So that's that first portion of the table. Questions about how much direction to give there. On the one end of the spectrum is that DLCD provides very little direction and just orients to the outcomes that that the program is looking for, and then reviews whatever the city comes up with, kind of in a show your work kind of scenario. And then on the far end of the spectrum, which is not listed here, would be DLCD prescribing how that happens, which is not an option. So what is listed here is in purple is more direction, but short of prescribing anything in the realm of a safe harbor about a pathway that jurisdictions could do the translation, that they could rely on as being an acceptable translation, and even the possibility of listing anything that the department identifies as a not acceptable translation. So those are the ways that we framed out the discussion, and similarly for the strategy selection. So once you have those types, characteristics, and locations of housing, then really crafting that HPS report, the Housing Production Strategy Report, requires coming up with a set of strategies that the local jurisdiction is going to pursue in order to meet that housing need. And so similarly, the rules need to be drafted with some version of direction to the local governments. And so questions about really how those rules and how much direction should be offered. So just an overview of how that meeting went was, various perspectives and kind of some mixed input, but generally that safe harbors would be valuable in giving local jurisdictions, particularly with limited capacity, who really want to meet the letter of the program, but need some direction on that. Safe harbors would be really valuable. But on the other hand, not wanting safe harbors to dilute in any way the goal of the program, which is really to be responsive to local context and local need, and having a universal safe harbor. That we're interested in ensuring that safe harbor was still effective in a number of ways. So there are some big questions yet to be answered, but we heard a lot of good feedback. And really that leads us to today to discuss a number of formats that support, that guidance, that direction might take shape. So I'll give it back to Madi.
Yes, sounds great. Thank you, Celestina. And that's exactly right. It leads us to our discussion. Before we jump in there, and we can go to the next slide, please. I just want to say to kind of help you all kind of understand exactly the intent behind the discussion, in order for the department to hold its responsibility of really creating an intentional and effective program that offers jurisdictions kind of a reliable pathway to meet their Goal 10 obligations, that now has this strong emphasis on affirmatively furthering fair housing without compromising the quality. There is an opportunity through this rulemaking to develop a framework for how the strategy should be selected and really offer that support to local governments and helping them to address their fair housing issues via the strategies in the right manner. The department will be reviewing and determining the sufficiency of the suite of housing production strategies that a local government puts forth. So it's a critical step that has an opportunity for us to really shape some framing around that and really offer that guidance that we know we've been hearing from local governments themselves. And so our focus is on the format of how to offer support to local governments in that strategy selection. For you today in your breakout rooms, the NAPTAC discussed 4 options. These 4 options are for you all to discuss too. And I'm just going to quickly overview the 4 options. And of course, if you have questions, definitely happy to answer. But the first option is it came out of the ONA, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis legislative report. This is the report that DLCD with our sister partner OHCS submitted to the legislature ahead of the 2023 session. Within that report, there was an example of a fair housing framework scenario. It really was about kind of thinking about fair housing issues in a format that uses an X and Y axes to really reveal fair housing issues and attach possible strategies to address those fair housing issues. In the report, the example, and it's just an example, it's a draft, but something for you all to chew on is it displays the production on the vertical axis or the y-axis, and then population diversity on the horizontal axis or the x-axis. And so this iteration can change, but it's one option that potentially DLCD can be thinking about, and it could be that we use this and place communities based on this X and Y axis, and maybe that's kind of the to help kind of them with the inputs and support that strategy selection. So that's kind of just a general idea of how that particular option could be further iterated and used, but something to think about. So pros and cons with that, definitely open to that in the discussion. Then the second option would be taking the equity indicators that OHCS has been charged to do under House Bill 2001, and rather than in the first option where it's limited to 2 variables, this option would be expansive to multiple variables that kind of fall within the scope of those equity indicators, and that really kind of build out scenarios that could exist in cities, and really help them to think through these scenarios and match the strategies that mitigate these scenarios or these fair housing issues that that would be revealed with multiple things. So just a quick example. So there's A through F in the statute, and the various indicators are listed. So say there's a high A, high B, low C. That could mean your city has X, and then these strategies are helpful in addressing this fair housing issue. So just a high level overview of what that option is. The third option is we have a really great menu of tools, actions, and policies. It's this big matrix, colorful. We've talked about it last time we were in the RAC, and we could continue to iterate that. Some folks in the NAPTAC talked about maybe we need additional tagging based on fair housing issue areas. So the option on the table is, do we forgo option 1, option 2, and maybe focus on option 3, but iterate that? That's an option for us to discuss. And lastly, another option for you all to kind of chew on is, does DLCD develop sort of a universal set of the most effective, maybe pro-housing strategies that could be a safe harbor or not, but are available to local governments for them to think about. Now, I will say those are the 4 options. There could be a 5th option if you all think about if there is something that is coming to mind. And it's not choose one. It's let's talk about all of them, and let's talk about their strengths and potential opportunities. And maybe there's 2 that really rise to the top for you. That's welcomed in the discussion. With that, I think that I need to give this back to you, Ben.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for all that context. We're going to jump into our breakout rooms. A couple things I just want to name that you'll see on slides on the mural board. So one, we've gotten feedback, and Alan, I think you expressed it really explicitly around the language of accessibility. These slides still have that language. That's not by intention. So that's something I just want to name, that the slides have not been updated based on that conversation. So when it says ensure accessibility, we are not using that language in relationship to kind of the accessibility and disability for a specific unit. So I'll just hold and name that. And then the other piece that we've gotten feedback on that you'll also see in this slide is language that talks about whiteness. High concentration of whiteness. We've gotten feedback that that's not an accurate way to describe it. So if you think about translating whiteness in this context to racially concentrated areas of affluence, I'll just name that we've gotten feedback. The slides have not caught up to that feedback as of yet. So I just wanted to name that before we go. So with that, let's transport back into our groups.
She says you paid it yesterday.
I guess we did see that time check.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome back. Let me figure out the groups here in my notes. I know who group one is because we're number one. Okay, do we have everybody back? Everybody's moving really slowly back on my screen, so I don't know if that's my bandwidth. Um, can folks hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, there's like a lot of people like giving me side eye kind of just by the way
We can hear you.
the camera's coming back. Okay, great, thank you. So we're gonna do a report out. So appreciate folks having what I imagine were great conversations as we did. So because their facilitator forgot to ask for a volunteer, we're going to start with Sean as our note taker for group one, and then we've prepped our other colleagues to add context as well. So Sean, we want to start for group one, and then I'll ask the other members to add additional thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for this, this report out, I think the intent is to be a little bit more conversational. And I think, like we had these kind of four options in front of us. And the point wasn't that we're going to choose one, but that we talk about maybe the strengths and weaknesses and the things we like, the things that we may be concerned about with each one. And I think that was reflected in the conversation of like a blending of the things that they liked from each of the different components. If you were to look at the quadrant piece, some of the things that we talked about in terms of what we liked about it was this idea that we could start to look at a point in time of where we're at in terms of things that might be happening in a particular city, things that might be affecting similar types of cities, say like coastal communities or recreation communities, that type of thing. And it enables kind of this ability to hone in on specific sets of strategies that could be offer a lot of flexibility and choice for different cities and kind of get into this mindset of setting ourselves up for success, which was kind of an underlying principle that we talked about in the beginning. But there were other kind of strengths that we saw too, like things with the menu approach provides a little bit of flexibility and choice in terms of the types of strategies that we adopt. But I also think that we kind of caution that a little bit too with this idea that, hey, it also is important to think broader about this idea that we need to have some kind of bare minimum or some type of basic parameters around this idea of like, in a coastal community, if you have a certain proportion of housing units that are going to be taken by, investors or second and vacation homes, right, that doesn't do anything for affordability. So we should be mindful of that. And then I think we also had a good conversation about this relationship between like safe harbors, the little bit more prescriptive but certain approach versus the more kind of flexible guidance options, right, and informing the discussions there and kind of maybe some of the pros and cons of each and maybe thinking about them in terms of for a lot of the HPS and thinking about this flexibility approach, maybe DLCD's role should be more guidance oriented, providing a lot of the blueprints or ways that policies can be constructed in a way that can help facilitate outcomes, but really reserving the more restrictive or kind of specific like safe harbory type approaches for more prescriptive processes, say for example the acceleration program, right? So those are some of the themes that I heard in the discussion. I'm also going to call on folks, please raise other things that came up. I know I'm giving it a very kind of brief overview. So yeah,
For
jump in.
our other group one colleagues, anything you want to lift up or give some life to? No, we're all excited when we talked about meaningfully contributing. Alyssa, I'm wondering if, because we started at that high level at the principles conversation, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. We were talking about before we jumped into which tool is the right tool to consider. We were talking about sort of what are the principles behind using these tools, and I think there was some agreement around the idea of these tools are really designed to empower and enable cities to achieve these goals rather than sort of looking at it from a punitive or a regulatory framework around, we have to hold you accountable for what you haven't done. So trying to figure out which tool allows for the most empowerment and sort of customization for communities that have a wide range of needs. And similarly, recognizing that, as we were talking about, as Sean was mentioning, being able to track your own change over time, sort of giving you the flexibility to recognize that conditions in your community might change. You might deploy tools that you find are not as successful, or maybe are more successful than you want. And so you want the flexibility to be able to use the accountability tool that allows you to be as successful as possible and calibrate and change as needed over time to accomplish your outcomes. And so I think we all sort of agreed that there should be some principles that point us in one direction or another. I think for a few of us, that kind of pointed us toward the 4-quadrant approach, just because of some of the things that Sean outlined in terms of what we see that using.
Right. Thank you for that. It was a strong starting point for the conversation. Let's move to group 2, make sure we can get through all the groups, and then if there's other reflections back. So Karen and
we assigned Brock. He bravely volunteered.
Brock, let's hear it.
Yeah. So generally, again, we agreed, safe harbors are going to be important both for, procedural certainty and reducing legal risk. But they need to be tied to what the need is. So there's going to be some form of analysis that will be needed to do that effectively. Make sure that it isn't entirely one size, like Elisa was talking about. We want to make sure that there's enough local flexibility to address, unique contexts within each city. We collectively preferred the table format just because we felt it was the most comprehensive. And, we think it could be expanded with some of the other pieces like the equity considerations, right? And having kind of general strategies. The quadrant piece we liked, but we felt that there was maybe a little bit too many quadrants that could be created, right? Because we have, like in the example, it has housing production and diversity, right? But, what if you have slightly different issues in your area? If, yours is more important about affordability in production, right? Or equity in production. And so it just seems like a lot of those would need to be created. A good evaluative tool, if local governments want to use that, when they're kind of building out their HPS, but as far as the guidance material itself, we thought the table would be the most effective. And if anyone disagrees or if there's anything I left off from the group, please jump in.
Thanks, Brock. Any group 2 additional thoughts, reflections, additions?
I also heard a note that we need to make sure that the policies are updated regularly, that, as we learn more about what the implementation looks like, that should be reflected in the way that this is implemented.
Thanks, Lorelei. Other group 2? And again, we can circle back depending on our timing. Celestina, Anita, group 3?
Yeah, hi, thanks everybody. Well, I asked my group for a volunteer, but we didn't get one. So Celestina's got a good note taker and we had some pretty lively conversation.
Good. Celestina, jump in.
Yeah, thanks so much. Okay, let's see. One of the places we landed was spending a little bit of time talking about aligning whatever framework we use and whatever direction that kind of pushes a jurisdiction with what is feasible in terms of financing and finding lending or funding for. And so trying to make sure that the strategies that again are being selected actually have a path forward to be implemented. And then we dug in a little bit more on that, on kind of what kind of flexibility on both ends of that question, kind of on the developer or the local government end and on the lender end, might we all start to collectively think about and advocate for. And so that's flexibility again in trying to tailor projects such that they might best get be funded or meet lending qualifications and not spend time on things that couldn't, but also thinking about how the lending world can begin to adopt some of the newer housing types and types of housing development, not in terms of construction or size type, but just overall types of housing that are needed. So we ended up digging in there quite a bit, but additionally, we talked about the equity indicators and the maybe the trade-offs of focusing on those and the scenarios in that they we didn't use the word limiting, but I think that in contrast to the housing production strategy menu of tools, that using the equity indicators and those scenarios might be more limiting than something like the tools that, the menu that is a little bit more comprehensive. But I don't know that I did the best job summarizing. So I would love if anyone on the team wants to jump back in and offer anything else, please do.
Thanks, Celestina. Group 3, any additions? Anna?
I'll add. I don't think like the equity indicators should be looked at as limiting, because I think they're a new way of looking at housing and measuring what kind of housing is built where and for who and why. And it's like housing, because I think it can also address that institutional kind of like inherent racism that's happened in the housing market. And so because it is a new way of like measuring it and really looking into it and like why, like, and where housing has been built, it could feel limiting. But if we don't do it, then we're going to continue the same system. And so it's like, this is an opportunity to create something that can benefit a wider group of folks.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I see some head nods around the room. Any others from group 3? Okay, nice work. Deb and Marty?
Kim is going to report out for us.
All right.
Thank you, Kim.
Everyone, yeah. So group 4, we discussed all the different scenarios, and one thing that I was hearing is some discomfort with the concept of safe harbor, and perhaps because it could limit some communities that want to and have been seeking to achieve some stretch goals. Some of the smaller communities express concern with the quadrant as an example, because it would demand too many resources just trying to figure out what quadrant you're in, versus just trying to look at the menu of options to solve the particular problems that you've identified in your community in terms of housing production and housing equity. I think there was generally comfort with using, looking at the menu of options and layering them, and of course doing the equity analysis. I have to apologize to the group. I didn't really hear one preference over another for these options. So if anyone wants to chime in.
All right, thanks, Kim. Group 4, any thoughts? You might not have heard it. Maybe you didn't get to there. Deb, jump in.
Well, yeah, a couple of things. Kim actually pointed out how it's not clear how sort of cities that have vulnerability indices would sort of layer into some of these, and how accommodating it is for that local analysis. And then just to expand on her comment about stretch goals, I mean, it's wanting to make sure, I think safe harbor, but probably for everything, just wanting to make sure that it's not such a rigid format that cities what's the word? They're more conservative in the strategies they're searching for, that they are able to set maybe a strategy that feels like a stretch goal, and not be penalized for maybe missing the mark if they're stretching like that. So just trying to find that balance in there, but maybe inspire cities to be a little more strident to get to the production needed.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Any others from group 4? Yeah, Mary Kyle.
Just one thing on the last aspect that Kim mentioned. I think there's a recognition that the 4 options don't seem to be clearly distinct, but rather elements of many of them can be blended together in structuring an approach.
Good, thank you. And a thumbs up. Okay, let's go to Cadence, Ethan. Who do y'all have?
Alan's going to report out for us.
Alan, thank you.
Yeah, I have the report out. So for group 5, I think it was like a lot of folks, we spent a lot of time talking about kind of the pros and cons of at least three of the 4 options there. And particularly around the menu of tools that already exists. I think there was a lot of support for continuing to use that as a tool and continuing to expand it with tags and other things that could make it more useful for jurisdictions. I think there was also some, particularly from the jurisdiction perspective, the sense that that evaluating how those tools might become strategies in a city it can be quite time consuming. And so really the sense that one of the ways that we recognize that in the process is to make sure that the HPS is an iterative process that we can then use to measure where a jurisdiction might be on implementing those tools. So some of those first phases might need to be, we just need to evaluate how these tools might work. We recognize that they might be effective, but for instance, to do a financial evaluation or financial modeling of construction excise tax might take the jurisdiction a long time to do that. But again, it seemed to be a lot of discussion about the use of the menu of tools and expanding that. And that sort of also played into the safe harbor piece around the universal set of strategies. The sense that it might be difficult to frame just one set of strategies that would capture the needs of lots of different types of communities. For instance, the sense that what one community might need for folks exiting houselessness in one community might be different than from another community. Let's see, and also again the sense that communities have different needs around those areas. Somebody also brought up the sense that we might also be able to use the tools list or the safe harbor as a way for reluctant jurisdictions, if we use it as a must-do type of list that jurisdiction would have to select from. So for instance, if you aren't meeting certain goals, then one of your must-dos would be upzoning areas of affluence to a certain level that we could make sure that you could produce enough of a certain type of housing. Let's see. What else am I missing? And with regard to the other tools, the XY axis tool, I think folks you saw that as a good tool for certain things, maybe for organizing the way we communicate with our communities, the way we organize the tools that we're implementing. So again, like lots of folks said, I think lots of intersections between the way the tools work and interact with one another. We didn't spend a lot of time on the equity indicators, and I'll just editorialize my own piece here. And I'm wondering if it's because it had the least sexy graphic to it. But I think what we recognize is that list of equity indicators underlies how we are using all 3 of those other tools, right? And so it's a really key component to how we implement those other tools. So it's certainly not left off, but just didn't have a fancy graphic there.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Well, that's one tactic is spruce up the graphics. And if you get to report out, you get to editorialize too. So that's you're modeling that reality. For group 5, any other thoughts, reflections, comments? Okay, let's go to Ellen and Thea.
Yep, so we have Ariel reporting out for our group.
Hi, everyone. So for group 6, hearing a lot of similar thoughts from our discussion. I think we found value in all of these approaches, but there was general support for identifying some best practices or most effective strategies with some caveats that not all strategies are going to have the same effect or be as effective in every situation, every community, every built environment. And also that those strategies need to be clearly tied, and I think Brock's group talked about this, clearly tied to the challenge or the need that you're solving for. We thought it would be helpful if, I know DLCD is reluctant to attribute value or rank any of the existing HPSs, but if we could get an objective summary of findings of, all HPSs did these strategies, or this one we saw happening in this part of the state, those kinds of things I think could really help inform future conversations and what these safe harbors could be. We had a conversation about, kind of leading off from the last conversation about infrastructure barriers, and the conversation from last time about in the audit or the referral process, there might be some cities who have an opt-out for reasons like natural disaster or big barriers. And we were wondering if in the HPS strategy, every city is going to do an analysis, right? And a deep dive information gathering. But when it comes to choosing their HPS, would it make sense for some cities who pre-identify to say, we are severely resource constrained, we really don't have capacity? Can we opt into like a very supportive track? Like, no, we're not going to not do an HPS, but can we go into like a cohort support group with DLCD, because we know that we only have capacity to really work on one thing, or we're really going to struggle to put all these pieces together and deliver on all of these things unless we have some strong guidance in the process. So that was something we put out that was, I think, a little different.
That's great. Thanks, Ariel. Others from Group 6. Not seeing any. I know we have a couple minutes left, but I guess I would just pause if there's anything coming up for anyone, as you've now heard some of those reflections from the different breakouts. Anything that anyone wants to put in the room? People are like, I'm hungry, ready to go. Let's do it. Next meeting's in July. Okay, well, let's move to the next steps. Couple pieces. So it really felt like a great conversation today. And we will do a post-meeting survey. I'm going to encourage folks to really give us some feedback, even if it's one question that you answer, to let us know about process, right? So this was the first time we used breakout rooms and the report out, and we'd love to get feedback. We're trying to make this process as meaningful as possible, and we're going to be jumping into some more detailed conversations as we get into the future. So I'll just pitch that. Anita, please.
Oh, I was just going to do I'll let you finish, but a little wrap up on just the equity discussion.
No, I was just making my first pitch. So why don't you jump into that?
Okay. It'll just be really quick. This is really great discussion. All this AFFH has just really up the equity framework. So it's giving staff a really great idea of how to frame this to the commission. What I was really excited about that Mari mentioned that NAPTAC is talking about restorative justice. That is one of the framework components. So hopefully when that conversation happens, to bring it back to RAC to hear what that looks like. So that would be very interesting. And then just the equity indicators and outcomes. So there's been a lot of rich discussion, especially in this meeting, and it's the content piece as well. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Adina. So I'll just note the reminder, as Ethan said at the beginning of the meeting, we're not going to be meeting in June. So our next meeting will be July 17th, and we'll make sure you know of that. But in our last couple minutes left, Ethan, love to have you close us out.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you all. I mean, the conversation that at least Breakout Room 5 had today was super insightful. So I am hoping and wishful that the other conversations, and it sounds like they were similar. So in terms of kind of just next steps, obviously you'll get the email from Ingrid here shortly with some follow-up information and the link to that post-meeting survey. Like Ben and Anita have mentioned, that survey is really, really helpful in guiding us and letting us know how we can structure this process in a way that's going to be most effective for discussion. So we really do appreciate your participation in that. And it gives you the space to kind of reflect on the discussion. If you have something that you say, oh, shoot, I forgot to mention that in the meeting, I can put it there in the survey. And those are critical in terms of us capturing those comments and incorporating those considerations into our process. But from here, I think enjoy the month of June without any further rulemaking advisory committee meetings or technical advisory committees. And thank you all for the time and engaging in this conversation. I think we're kind of setting ourselves up for a moment here to reflect and respond. And then when we come back in July, kind of pencil in on your calendar, July 10th is getting that first draft of both the NAPTAC and the HOTTAC draft rule. So I'm really looking forward to where the conversation goes from here. And thank you all for the time.
Awesome. Thanks, Ethan. Well, one of my favorite things is that it's 12 o'clock on the dot. We're on time. Let's get out of here before it turns 12:01. Much love. Enjoy the rest of your day. Great work. Take care.
All the time.
Hi, Anita. Are you still there?
On the dot. We're on time. Let's get out of here before it